In today's political climate, people don't just support a political party, they identify with it, often to the exclusion of all other viewpoints. This level of polarization can make any disagreement feel like an existential threat, setting the stage for conflict. Political scientist Barbara Walter warns that intense political polarization based on identity, rather than ideology, is a key warning sign of impending civil war. Another crucial factor? The two opposing factions must be roughly equal in size and equally fearful of being crushed by the other. Sound familiar? There's another pattern at play. The group that usually initiates civil war is the one that was politically dominant but is now experiencing a decline. As Walter puts it, these groups have either lost political power or are in the process of losing it, and they genuinely believe that the country is rightfully theirs. They feel justified in using force to reclaim control because they see the system as broken. This dynamic makes the 2024 U.S. presidential election a potential flashpoint. If the losing side believes the election was stolen or feels that their very existence is under threat, they might resort to violence to protect what they see as their rightful place in society. With both sides deeply convinced of their own righteousness, the conditions for violent conflict could be set. A second U.S. civil war, what would it actually look like? Before we dive in, it's worth noting that calling this potential conflict a second U.S. civil war assumes a specific framework for how it might unfold. However, the reality is that such a conflict would look vastly different from the first civil war, both in terms of who is fighting, how they are fighting, and how the violence begins. While there are many unsettling scenarios to consider, our analysis will borrow from three key historical events that could serve as a blueprint for what a modern U.S. civil war might resemble. The first relevant historical event is the Troubles, a violent conflict in Northern Ireland that lasted about 3 decades. It involved paramilitary groups, soldiers, and police, claiming around 3,600 lives. Interestingly, the Troubles have long inspired America's far-right underground. Even while the conflict was ongoing, there were calls to model America after Ireland's period of unrest. The second historical parallel is Italy's years of lead, a period of political turmoil and terrorism between the late 1960s and late 1980s. This era saw bombings, assassinations, and kidnappings carried out by extremist groups from both ends of the political spectrum. The violence claimed over 1,200 lives, fueling an atmosphere of fear and instability. The final comparison is La Violencia, a brutal 10-year civil war in Colombia that erupted in 1948 between supporters of the liberal and conservative parties. Marked by rural massacres and widespread violence, this conflict took the lives of at least 200,000 people, meaning that 1 in every 50 Colombians was killed. With these historical parallels in mind, let's construct a picture of what a second U.S. civil war might look like. Who would be fighting? Unlike the 1860s, when the North and South were clearly defined, no such neat geographic division exists today. Yes, we have blue states that lean Democratic and red states that lean Republican, but this division is not as rigid as it might seem. For example, Maine has consistently voted Democratic in presidential elections for decades, but its rural interior is a Trump stronghold. Similarly, California is known as a deep blue state, yet its inland areas are far more conservative than its coastal cities. Even Texas, often considered a Republican stronghold, has major Democratic urban centers in Houston, Dallas, and Austin. So, if a civil war were to break out, it wouldn't be state versus state. It would be more like county versus county. In the 2020 election, Trump carried 2,588 counties with around 130 million residents, mostly in rural areas. Biden won in just 551 counties, but those counties housed nearly 200 million people, primarily in urban centers. But does this mean we'd see massive armies of millions of Republicans and Democrats facing off in battle? Not at all. A second U.S. civil war wouldn't involve large armies, major battles, or rank-and-file soldiers marching into conflict. Instead, the fighting would be decentralized, scattered, and asymmetrical. How would the factions form? Newsflash, they already exist. Thanks to social media, it has never been easier to rally like-minded individuals around a cause. Unlike traditional military organizations, these factions can assemble quickly, operate in loosely connected cells, and just as easily dissolve, making them difficult to track or counter. Worse still, modern technology allows anyone to claim allegiance to an ideology and carry out violence in its name. Take Antifa, for example. There's no official membership list or centralized command. This means that virtually anyone can adopt the Antifa label and commit acts of violence, regardless of whether they align with the movement's actual goals. The same principle applies to extremist groups like the Oath Keepers, Proud Boys, and Boogaloo Bois on the right, as well as anarchist and far-left militant factions. And as tensions escalate, new factions will undoubtedly emerge, spurring counter-responses from the opposing side. Before long, we could see an explosion of militant groups eager for conflict. What would trigger the war? That's the thing. No one knows. History has shown that major conflicts often take people by surprise, even when the warning signs are obvious in hindsight. Political scientist Barbara Walter notes that while experts can predict civil wars years in advance, the general public is often blindsided. For instance, British authorities failed to recognize the imminent danger of the 1916 Easter Rising in Ireland until mere days before the rebellion. Similarly, in Yugoslavia, the elite dismissed early Serbian militia activity as trivial until the war erupted. In Colombia, tensions between liberals and conservatives had been simmering for years, but few expected the country to plunge into chaos until the assassination of liberal leader Jorge Eliezer Gaitan in 1948 sent shockwaves through the nation. What would the fighting look like? Rather than large-scale battles, a modern civil war would likely take the form of sporadic, unpredictable violence. Some argue that it has already begun, pointing to events like the January 6th Capitol riot, the attack on Paul Pelosi, and the failed assassination attempt on Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. If this conflict escalates, it would likely mirror the years of lead in Italy, where bombings and targeted assassinations created a constant sense of fear and uncertainty. A key tactic of that era was false flag attacks, where one faction would commit violence but frame the other side, further deepening distrust. The violence would be everywhere and nowhere, highly concentrated in certain hotspots, while large portions of the country remain untouched. Even during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, many people never experienced violence firsthand, despite living in a country of just 1.5 million. Now imagine a country as vast as the U.S., with a population of 333 million. How long would it last? Conflicts like the Troubles lasted 30 years. La Violencia persisted for a decade. The years of lead spanned 15 years. If the U.S. descends into civil conflict, it could be a prolonged period of unrest, fear, and violence. However, many experts argue that a full-blown civil war remains unlikely, pointing out that no sophisticated, democratic country like the U.S. has ever faced such a fate. They believe Americans are more disillusioned than fanatical, more pragmatic than impulsive. Then again, history has a way of proving people wrong. So what do you think? Is the U.S. on the brink of civil war, or is this just fear-mongering? Let us know your thoughts in the comments.